Kaiser Wilhelm II and the German Empire. Berlin, the 9th of November, 1918. A telephone rings in a railway car near Spa, Belgium. The man who answers is 59, a mustache waxed into two sharp points, 4 years earlier the commander of the largest army in Europe. Now his own generals are telling him the truth. The soldiers want peace, the soldiers want him gone, and if he tries to march troops home to crush the revolution, they will not obey him. His name is Wilhelm II, and he is the last emperor of Germany. He inherited the throne in 1888 at 29, grandson of Queen Victoria, cousin to the future King George V, and to Tsar Nicholas II, heir to an empire barely 17 years old. Forged by Bismarck out of blood and iron in 1871. Within 2 years, he had fired the architect, dismissed Bismarck, and took personal control of foreign policy, building the instrument that would destroy him, a battle fleet to rival the Royal Navy. Alliances stretched to breaking, a foreign policy of grand gestures and wounded pride. He wanted Germany's place in the sun. What he built instead was a continent primed to explode. By the autumn of 1918, everything failed at once. The last German offensive collapsed, the Allies pushed back across France, and Germany's allies surrendered one after another. It started, oddly, with sailors. On the 29th of October, the High Seas Fleet mutinied rather than sail on a suicidal last battle, and the mutiny spread from port to port. Workers' and soldiers' councils sprang up across Germany. By the 7th of November, the King of Bavaria had abdicated. Wilhelm was at military headquarters, insulated from Berlin, still clinging to fantasies of compromise. Groener's call ended them. On the 9th of November, without Wilhelm's consent, the Chancellor announced to the press that the Kaiser had abdicated, technically a lie, but it made itself true. Within hours, Germany was declared a republic from a Reichstag balcony. The Kaiserreich Bismarck built ceased to exist that afternoon while its emperor sat helpless in a railway carriage. Wilhelm crossed into the Netherlands the next day and formally abdicated 3 weeks later. He lived another 23 years in exile at Dorn, chopping wood, writing memoirs that blamed everyone but himself, and in 1940 sent Hitler a congratulatory telegram after the fall of France, hoping absurdly for restoration. It never came. He died in 1941, having outlived his empire by 23 years. Number 2. Franz Joseph I and Charles I, and the disappearance of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. Franz Joseph had ruled since 1848, holding together an empire that made no natural sense. 11 nationalities, from Germans and Hungarians to Czechs, Poles, Croats, and Serbs, bound by nothing but loyalty to his person and the bureaucracy that served him. Vienna was one of the great cultural capitals of the world, home to Freud, Mahler, and Klimt, even as the empire's nationalities pulled harder against the seams every year. His answer to every strain was more paperwork, never real reform. When his heir, Archduke Franz Ferdinand, was assassinated in Sarajevo in 1914, his government used it to try to crush Serbian nationalism and drag the continent into war. He died in 1916, 2 years in, never seeing the end. That fell to his grandnephew Charles, 29, barely 2 years as heir. He inherited a war he hadn't chosen, and an empire whose peoples were already looking past Vienna. He tried secret peace talks with France in 1917. They leaked and humiliated him. He proposed a federal restructuring, giving the nationalities autonomy. It came too late. By 1918, they wanted independence outright. Throughout October, one nationality after another simply declared itself independent of Vienna without waiting for permission, without much resistance from Habsburg authorities who no longer had the will or the troops to stop them. On the 28th of October, Czech leaders in Prague proclaimed the independent Republic of Czechoslovakia. On the 29th, The South Slav peoples of the empire, Croats, Slovenes, and Serbs, declared their own state, which would soon merge with the Kingdom of Serbia to form Yugoslavia. Poland, restored after more than a century of partition among Austria, Germany, and Russia, declared its own independence, absorbing Austrian Galicia along with it. Hungary, Charles's own separate crown, declared itself a fully independent republic on the 16th of November. What remained, the German-speaking Alpine and Danubian core of the old empire, declared itself the Republic of German Austria on the 12th of November, one single day after Charles signed away his powers, though he pointedly never called it abdication. Bahadur Shah II, the last emperor of the Mughals. He died in a small house in Rangoon in 1862, at 87, composing mournful verses about exile. Buried in an unmarked grave, the British deliberately concealed, for fear it would become a shrine. The Mughal Empire, founded in 1526 by Babur and expanded by Akbar and Aurangzeb across nearly all of India, was by Bahadur Shah Zafar's accession in 1837, a hollow shell. Real power belonged to the British East India Company, and the emperor was little more than a pensioned figurehead in the Red Fort. In May 1857, company sepoys mutinied at Meerut over grievances built up for years over pay, promotion, and cultural insensitivity, sharpened by an explosive rumor that new rifle cartridges were greased with cow and pig fat, an abomination to Hindu and Muslim soldiers alike. They marched to Delhi and asked the 82-year-old emperor to lead a restored Mughal throne. He hesitated, seeing little chance of success, but was given no real choice. Rebellion spread across northern India in what the British called the Sepoy Mutiny, and Indian nationalists later called the First War of Independence. His role was largely passive. He issued proclamations, while his sons and rebel commanders squabbled. The British response was ferocious. A siege of Delhi, house-to-house fighting, then mass reprisals. Bahadur Shah fled, surrendered, and watched his sons executed without trial. He himself was tried for treason in his own former throne room and exiled to Rangoon in 1858, stripped of everything his family had ruled for 3 centuries. The British Parliament abolished the East India Company and transferred India to the Crown, closing the Mughal era and opening the Raj. Number 4. Tsar Nicholas II and the Fall of the Russian Empire. Yekaterinburg, the early hours of 17 July 1918. A family of 7 and 4 servants are woken and led into a basement, told they are being moved for their own safety. An officer reads a statement. The Ural Soviet has decided they must be executed. The shooting takes several horrifying minutes, partly because the daughters have jewels sewn into their corsets. His name was Nicholas II, last Tsar of all the Russias, executed in the ruins of his own empire less than a year and a half after abdicating a throne his family had held for 3 centuries. Nicholas inherited the empire in 1894 at 26, by his own admission unready to rule a sixth of the Earth's land surface, encompassing more than 100 ethnic groups under an autocracy that had barely begun to modernize. Defeat by Japan in 1904 to 1905 triggered revolution and forced him to grant Russia's first elected parliament, the Duma, a concession he spent a decade quietly trying to claw back. Then came 1914. In 1915, he personally took command at the front, making himself personally responsible for every defeat, while his wife and the scandal-ridden mystic Rasputin ran the government at home. Rasputin was murdered in 1916. The damage was already done. The end came astonishingly fast. In late February 1917, bread shortages and wartime exhaustion triggered strikes and street protests in Petrograd that grew within days into a full-scale mutiny of the garrison troops sent to suppress them. Soldiers refused to fire on crowds. Some turned their weapons on their own officers instead. Within roughly a week, the entire administrative apparatus of the capital had dissolved. replaced by a hastily formed provisional government drawn from the Duma and a rival body, the Petrograd Soviet of Workers' and Soldiers' Deputies, both claiming authority simultaneously. Nicholas, still at military headquarters hundreds of miles away, tried to return to the capital by train and found his own railway lines blocked by revolutionary troops, forcing his train to divert to Pskov instead. There, on the 2nd of March 1917, surrounded by his own generals, who told him plainly that the army itself would not support him any longer, Nicholas signed his abdication in a railway carriage. Initially in favor of his hemophiliac son Alexei, then, learning the boy's medical condition made that impractical, in favor of his brother Grand Duke Michael instead. Michael, seeing the writing on the wall with total clarity, declined the crown the very next day, refusing to accept power unless a future constituent assembly offered it to him. It never did. In the space of about 72 hours, the Romanov dynasty, which had ruled Russia since 1613, simply ceased to hold power, with no one left willing to wear the crown at all. Nicholas and his family were placed under house arrest, first at their palace outside Petrograd, then moved further and further from the capital as the political situation grew more dangerous. First to Tobolsk in Siberia, and finally, after the Bolsheviks seized power in October 1917 and civil war broke out across Russia, to a merchant's house in Yekaterinburg in the Ural Mountains. A house the Bolsheviks grimly renamed the House of Special Purpose, as anti-Bolshevik white forces advanced toward Yekaterinburg in the summer of 1918, threatening to liberate the former Tsar and turn him into a rallying symbol for the counter-revolution. The local Bolshevik authorities decided the entire family had to be eliminated rather than risk that outcome. Number 5. Puyi, the last emperor of China. For 12 years he lived in that gilded bubble, a boy emperor ruling nothing beyond the Forbidden City's walls, surrounded by eunuchs and imperial ritual. Tutored by an Englishman named Reginald Johnston, who introduced him to bicycles, Western clothing, and the modern world beyond his cage. In 1924, a warlord's coup expelled him for good. He fled to the Japanese concession in Tianjin, and Japan found a use for him. After invading Manchuria in 1931, it installed Puyi as puppet head of the new state of Manchukuo, crowning him Emperor Kangde in 1934, a hollow restoration, real power resting entirely with the Japanese army. He later called it his most suffocating imprisonment. The funny thing is, Puyi was placed on the Qing throne in 1908 at the age 2, chosen by the dying Empress Dowager Cixi. He inherited an empire already collapsing under decades of foreign humiliation and unequal treaties. In October 1911, an uprising in Wuchang triggered provincial declarations of independence across the country. By February 1912, not yet 6, Puyi abdicated in exchange for a pension and the right to keep living inside the Forbidden City, and that's how he started living simply behind the Forbidden City's walls, and contributed to the quick downfall. That second empire vanished even faster than the first. Soviet forces shattered the Japanese army in Manchuria in August 1945. Puyi was captured fleeing toward Japan and spent 5 years a Soviet prisoner. Then, a decade in Chinese re-education, writing confessions of collaboration. Released in 1959, he lived out his life as an ordinary citizen, a gardener, then an editor, dying of cancer in 1967 amid the Cultural Revolution. Puyi is the only man in history to watch not one empire disappear beneath him, but 2. Number 6. Napoleon Bonaparte and the fall of the First French Empire. In my humble opinion, Napoleon's rise remains one of the most improbable stories in modern history. Imagine a minor Corsican noble of no great wealth or connection who used the chaos of the French Revolution to climb, through sheer military talent and political ruthlessness, from artillery officer to first consul of France by 1799, and finally to Emperor of the French in 1804, crowning himself in Notre Dame Cathedral rather than allowing the Pope to place the crown on his head, a gesture that told all of Europe exactly whose authority he considered supreme. For a decade after that coronation, Napoleon's Grande Armée appeared nearly unstoppable, crushing the combined forces of Austria and Russia at Austerlitz in 1805, in what many historians still consider his single greatest tactical masterpiece, dismantling Prussia in a matter of weeks in 1806, and redrawing the map of Europe into a network of client kingdoms, satellite states, and annexed territories that put a Bonaparte or a loyal Napoleonic marshal on nearly every throne on the continent. By 1810, the French Empire, at its territorial peak, directly controlled or dominated the vast majority of continental Europe, and Napoleon, married by then to an Austrian archduchess and father to a newborn son, styled the King of Rome, appeared to have founded a dynasty that might rule for generations. It began to unravel in Russia. Oh, Russia! It's the place where eventually Germany under Hitler would also fail. I find it so funny how Napoleon already did this mistake, yet 200 years later, Hitler would do exactly the same. In June 1812, Napoleon led an invasion force of over 600,000 men, the largest army Europe had ever assembled, deep into Russian territory, intending to force Tsar Alexander I back into compliance with his continental economic blockade against Britain. The campaign turned into one of the great military disasters in history. Russian forces refused to give decisive battle, retreating and burning their own territory as they went, drawing Napoleon's army deeper into a hostile country with lengthening and increasingly vulnerable supply lines. Napoleon captured Moscow in September 1812, only to find the city set ablaze by its own retreating governor and largely empty of the food and shelter his exhausted army desperately needed. He waited 5 weeks for a peace offer that never came, then began a retreat that coincided with the onset of the brutal Russian winter. Of the roughly 600,000 men who crossed into Russia that summer, only a small fraction, some estimates put it as low as 100,000, made it back out alive. Europe's powers seized the moment, defeating his rebuilt army at Leipzig in October 1813. Allied troops entered Paris in March 1814. His own marshals refused to fight on. Napoleon abdicated unconditionally on 6 April after a failed suicide attempt and was exiled to Elba, remarkably granted sovereignty over the tiny island itself. He didn't stay. In February 1815, he landed back in France. Troops sent to arrest him rejoined him instead, all the way to Paris, without a shot fired. His 100-day restoration ended at Waterloo on 18 June 1815. He abdicated for the final time, 4 days later. This time there was no comfortable island. He was shipped to remote Saint-Day, Helena, where he died in 1821, having built an empire, watched it collapse, rebuilt it in 100 days, and watched it collapse again, forever, from a rock in the South Atlantic. Number 7. Darius III and the Fall of the Achaemenid Persian Empire. Northern Persia, July 330 BC. A king lies dying in an ox cart, stabbed by his own satrap, ruler in title only of the largest empire the world had yet seen. Darius III took the Persian throne in 336 BC, installed by a court eunuch who had already poisoned 2 kings, and whom Darius promptly had killed. He inherited a wealthy, sophisticated empire troubled by instability and an old rivalry with the Greek world about to turn catastrophically personal. That same year, 20-year-old Alexander inherited the throne of the small kingdom of Macedon after his father Philip II was assassinated. Within 2 years, having secured his own throne, he crossed into Asia Minor with roughly 40,000 men, intent on completing his father's planned revenge against Persia. Persian satraps were crushed at the Granicus in 334 BC. Darius took the field himself at Issus in 333 BC with a vastly larger army, but the terrain neutralized his numbers, and when the battle turned, he fled, abandoning his own chariot and family, who were captured. Darius offered huge concessions for peace. Alexander refused, wanting total conquest. At Gaugamela in October 331 BC, Darius raised one final enormous army and fled again when it broke, a second flight that finished his authority. Retreating east, he became a prisoner of his own officials. In July 330 BC, the satrap Bessus and his conspirators stabbed Darius and left him to die, hoping to buy their own survival. Alexander's cavalry found him dying, covered his body with a cloak, and sent it for a royal burial, casting himself as Persia's legitimate successor, not its destroyer. Number 8. Moctezuma II and the Fall of the Aztec Empire. Tenochtitlan, 8 November 1519. The ruler of the largest empire in the Americas crosses a causeway to greet a few hundred foreign strangers, led by Hernán Cortés, backed by thousands of indigenous allies who despise Aztec rule. Moctezuma chooses diplomacy, welcoming Cortés into his capital of some 200,000 to 300,000 people. Within 2 years, both empire and emperor will be gone. Moctezuma had inherited the throne in 1502, ruling not a unified state, but a vast tributary system, dozens of subject city-states paying tribute in goods, labor, and captives in exchange for being largely left to govern themselves. It generated enormous wealth for Tenochtitlan and enormous resentment among subject peoples forced to supply captives for ritual sacrifice, resentment that would prove more decisive to the empire's fall than anything the Spanish brought. Cortés, exceeding his official authority, recruited thousands of these resentful allies, especially the Tlaxcalans, turning the coming conflict into as much an indigenous rebellion as a European conquest. Cortés soon seized Moctezuma and ruled through him as a puppet. The arrangement collapsed in spring 1520, when Spanish soldiers massacred unarmed nobles during a festival, sparking open revolt. Cortés brought the captive Moctezuma onto a balcony to calm the crowd. They stoned their own emperor, who died days later. Some accounts blame the Spanish instead. His death triggered the Spanish retreat, known as La Noche Triste, but Cortés returned a year later, besieged Tenochtitlan for 3 months, aided by a smallpox epidemic that devastated the city, and captured the last Aztec emperor, Cuauhtémoc, on 13 August 1521. Tenochtitlan fell for good, soon rebuilt as Mexico City. Number 9. Atahualpa and the Fall of the Inca Empire. Cajamarca, 16 November 1532. Atahualpa, sovereign of the largest empire the Western Hemisphere had produced, enters the plaza on a golden litter with thousands of attendants to meet fewer than 200 Spanish adventurers, led by Francisco Pizarro. Within hours, he will be seized. Within 8 months, dead. Atahualpa had just won a brutal civil war against his half-brother Huáscar, a conflict following the death of their father Huayna Capac, likely from a smallpox epidemic already spreading south from Spanish contact zones that left the empire's armies exhausted, its administration disrupted at precisely the wrong moment. Confident in his vastly superior numbers, he saw no threat in Pizarro's tiny force and brought thousands of lightly armed attendants to the meeting as a show of majesty. Spanish soldiers concealed around the plaza ambushed the procession, cutting down thousands with steel, firearms, and cavalry the Inca had never faced, and seized Atahualpa alive. Realizing what his captors valued, he offered history's largest ransom, a room filled once with gold and twice with silver for his freedom, roughly 6 tons of gold and twice that in silver, gathered over months. He also ordered Huáscar killed from captivity, removing any rival claim. Despite the ransom being paid, Pizarro, fearing a rescue attempt, put Atahualpa on trial in July 1533 on charges including idolatry and rebellion, in a process even contemporaries called a formality. Sentenced to burn, he accepted baptism to secure death by strangulation instead, and was garroted on 26 July 1533. A resistant state lingered for decades in the mountains, but the unified empire he had briefly ruled ended the moment its sovereign was executed. Number 10. Constantine XI Palaiologos and the Fall of Constantinople. Constantinople, the early hours of 29, May 14, 53. An emperor stands on walls that have held for over 1,000 years, having stripped off his imperial regalia to fight simply as a soldier. Outside, an Ottoman army of 60,000 to 80,000, backed by the largest siege cannon ever built, has spent nearly 2 months battering those walls. Inside, perhaps 7,000 defenders hold 12 miles of fortifications. Word comes that troops have poured through an unlocked postern gate, the Kirkaporta. The emperor throws himself into the final fighting and is never seen again. His name was Constantine VII, the last Roman emperor, and the empire he died defending had endured, in some form, since Augustus. Constantine inherited what remained of Byzantium in 1449, by then little more than the city itself and scattered outposts. Shrunk over 11 centuries from a Mediterranean superpower that once stretched from Italy to Egypt into essentially a single fortified city, ground down by Crusader plunder, most catastrophically, the sack of Constantinople by fellow Christians in 1204, and relentless Ottoman conquest. He spent his reign begging Western Europe for aid, offering to reunite the Orthodox and Catholic churches in exchange. The help that came, a few hundred Genoese and Venetian soldiers, was nowhere near enough. The young Sultan Mehmed II, obsessed with taking the city, built a fortress to cut off its supply and commissioned a Hungarian engineer, previously turned away by Constantine for lack of funds, to build siege cannon that could finally breach the ancient walls. The siege began in April 1453. For nearly 2 months, the defenders held on with extraordinary ingenuity, even stringing a chain across the Golden Horn, forcing Mehmed to haul his ships overland to bypass it. But the disparity in numbers made the outcome, to most observers, only a matter of time. The final assault came before dawn, on 29 May. Ottoman troops found the Kirkaporta gate unsecured and poured through, attacking the defenders from behind. Constantine reportedly said the city had fallen and he was still alive, then threw off his regalia and charged into the fighting. No confirmed body, grave, or remains were ever found. That afternoon, Mehmed rode to the Hagia Sophia and had it converted into a mosque. The last living fragment of the Roman Empire, nearly 1,500 years old, ceased to exist. Its final emperor vanishing into the chaos rather than living to see the aftermath, as so many of the others on this list did. All 10 of these men inherited thrones that seemed permanent. Every one watched that assumption collapse within his own lifetime, some within weeks. Some died in exile, forgotten. Some died at the hands of people who had once knelt before them. One died fighting, sword in hand, in the wreckage of the empire he refused to outlive. What connects Wilhelm II to Constantine XI, separated by 5 centuries, is the same brutal truth. No empire, however ancient or powerful, is guaranteed to outlast the man sitting on its throne when history decides its time is up. If this list changed how you think about the fall of empires, hit that like button, subscribe, so you never miss our deep dives into history's rulers and empires. Drop a comment and tell us which of these 10 collapses surprised you most, and which fallen empire deserves its own video next. Thanks for watching. We'll see you in the next one.